Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I'm so glad to have you with me here today. This video is a week late because I got a nasty cold and that prevented me from filming or doing pretty much anything. I was in bed for a week and I feel like colds have gotten so much worse since COVID. Have any of you experienced that? I feel like, I've had colds before, but none that have ever kept me in bed for a week. But anyhow, I apologize for this video being late, but I'm here now. So this is a remake of an old video. I made this video originally, I think in 2019, and I wanted to remake it because, well, for several reasons. First of all, I was not very good at filming back then. I didn't really know what I was doing, so the quality has gotten better. I also feel like back at that time, I wasn't really writing out scripts for my videos, so I didn't really know what I wanted to say. It was all off the cuff, and I wanted to have it be more polished so I'd actually know what I wanted to say going into it. So I am remaking this video here. I hope you enjoy. But before we do that, I want to say please remember to like this video and subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you can be notified of new uploads. Leave comments down below. I love reading your comments. And a huge thank you to the people who support this channel on Patreon. I'm going to leave their names listed at the end of the video. If you would also like to support this channel on Patreon, there'll be a link in the description. No hard feelings if you can't. I certainly understand money being tight. However, there will be hard feelings if you don't follow me on Instagram. The link will also be in the description because Instagram is free. I'm also going to list my email in the description in case you need to get in touch with me for any reason. Okay, we're going to get into it now. So Victorian era fashion is known for being exaggerated. Every decade, women were using their clothing to change their bodies into some new exaggerated shape. Here is a rather humorous video to display the evolution of the rather bizarre shapes that were fashionable throughout the 19th century. Now, the 19th century, or the Victorian era, I'm going to be using those terms pretty much interchangeably in this video, even though the Victorian era started about a third of the way through the 19th century, but for the sake of this video, 19th century equals Victorian era. So the Victorian era is not the only time in history when women and men, to a lesser extent, have used clothing to alter the shape of their body. In the early to mid 16th century, women wore a sort of hoop skirt that was called a Spanish farthingale, and it held the skirt out in a very cone shape, and their sleeves were very wide and had these trumpet-shaped ends. In the late 16th century, women had moved on from these Spanish farthingales, these triangular cone-shaped Spanish farthingales, and had started wearing bum rolls and French farthingales, which give the wearer the appearance of emerging from a drum. They had also adopted the use of these things, these sort of proto-corset type things. They're called a pair of bodies. And there were even references to sleeve farthingales. So these are basically hoop skirts for your sleeves to make your sleeves stand out. At the same time in history, men were wearing something called a peascod belly, which is a type of padding that would go over the abdomen and created the illusion of a pot belly, and I swear I'm not making that up. They also used outsized cod pieces, which were, of course, phallic representations, and they were also little purses, but they were a piece of clothing that was used to alter the appearance of the underlying anatomy. Men and women also wore various types of padding and hoops and farthingales and proto-corset type things throughout the 17th century. And then, of course, in the 18th century, women started wearing side hoops or paniers. These are the ridiculous false hips of the Ancien Régime, and they were the standard uniform for women in every court in Europe. Side hoops remained a sort of court uniform for decades after they had gone out of fashion and had been replaced by various types of false rumps. So why are people obsessed with changing the shapes of their bodies with their clothing? Part of this is what I like to call the childbearing hips explanation, and this is the idea that people, especially women, like to exaggerate their silhouettes in different ways to make themselves look more fertile. So they're exaggerating these elements of fertility. I think that this is true, but only to a certain extent. I think that humans tend to find signs of fertility to be attractive, and that is what they were going for. So, for example, an aristocratic woman in the 1760s would not have been thinking, I will exaggerate my hips in order to make myself look more fertile. No, she was thinking, I will exaggerate my hips in order to make myself look more attractive. And it just so happens that what we perceive to be attractive generally lines up with indicators of fertility, although not always. But this would explain why people tend to always go back to exaggerating the same elements of their anatomy, why men tend to go back to codpiece type things, and why women tend to emphasize their hips, buttocks, and breasts, and not, for example, trying to make their necks look thicker than they actually are, or trying to make their heads look unnaturally bulbous. Because if it were just about experimentation and trying new things, surely anything would be up for grabs. But no, we seem to be kind of going for the same basic silhouette in different ways. People have also suggested the explanation that people in the past really wanted to show off how much expensive fabric they could afford, so they went for these very exaggerated shapes. Again, I think that there is certainly something to this, but I don't think that it was a very one-to-one comparison. I don't think a woman in the 1760s would be necessarily thinking, I want to show people that I can afford this much fabric, so I'm going to make my skirt very, very wide. I think it was much more subconscious than that. But whatever reasons people, primarily women, have had throughout history for exaggerating their silhouettes, those reasons likely did not change once you got to the Victorian era. Rather, what did change was the frequency and magnitude to which people were altering their silhouettes through clothing, and the accessibility of these silhouette-altering garments. The Victorian era was the first time in history when common, everyday people could participate in the body shape changing fashions. In all of the examples that I've previously given, bum rolls, farthingales, side hoops, etc., those were reserved for the elites, the aristocracy, the super rich. For example, while Marie Antoinette was dressing like this, the average woman in Europe and America was dressing like this. You can see that this woman is not engaging in the same sort of body shape modification in which Marie Antoinette was engaging. Additionally, the degree to which people were wearing these body-changing contraptions and the speed at which the fashionable silhouette changed and the context in which people were wearing these garments changed. So again, for example, Marie Antoinette was not dressing like this every day. This was only worn for very ceremonial, formal court occasions. Whereas in the 1880s, most women would be wearing some sort of a bustle cage every day. Now, it might be a smaller one for the day-to-day tasks and then a larger one for more formal occasions, but some sort of bustle cage or padding would have been worn every day in the 1880s for most women, provided that they're not, factory workers or working in some sort of enclosed environment with heavy machinery. That was something new that came about in the 19th century. An example of how ubiquitous and cheap these figure-changing garments can be found in an 1864 book called A History of American Manufacturers. This book claimed that, quote, "It is estimated that as many as 60,000 hoop skirts of various sizes are made each day during 8 months of the year. That equals about 14.4 million hoop skirts in the year being manufactured just in the United States." In 1864, when that book was published, the population of the United States was roughly 35 million people. Now, assuming that roughly half of those were women, and roughly half of those women were adults, that leaves us with approximately 8.7 million hoop skirt-aged women in the United States. So, if the United States was not exporting any hoop skirts, which it seems likely that they wouldn't be, or if they were, they wouldn't be exporting very many of them because most other countries had their own hoop factories. That would mean that, on average, roughly, every woman in the United States would need to be buying roughly 2 hoop skirts every year in order to create this kind of demand. Now, that's a very rough estimation, and those figures were done at 1 o'clock last morning, so take them with a grain of salt, but it does give an idea of just how ubiquitous these fashionable shape-changing garments were. So why was that? Why did they become so ubiquitous, and why did they take off in the Victorian era with such a vengeance? And I think that can be summed up in one word: industrialization. There are no exact dates for the Industrial Revolution, but most experts agree that it took place roughly between the years 1760 and 1900. In the very beginning, its impacts were limited primarily to industries and farming, with the invention, respectively, of the cotton gin and the spinning jenny. Also, for the longest time, I thought that the spinning jenny was called the rattling jenny, and I don't know why I thought that, but just in researching for this video did I learn that the rattling jenny is not a thing, and it's called the spinning jenny. So that was a small galaxy brain moment for me. But with the invention of the cotton gin and the spinning jenny. Now, these certainly did have impacts on everyday people's lives. The spinning jenny made cloth significantly more affordable than it was when it had to be woven by hand. But in general, the early advancements were aimed at industries and not at everyday people. However, by the 1840s, these advancements, these industrial advancements, had begun to trickle down and to impact the everyday lives of everyday people. People began to decorate their homes with mass-produced knickknacks and mass-produced pieces of furniture. They were wearing mass-produced jewelry. They were using increasingly more and more complex machines in their everyday lives. The Victorians loved science and innovation, and these new industrial processes and products gave the perfect excuse to indulge in these passions.
The Victorians were so delighted by innovation and by science, and they loved the idea of tricking themselves, and also they loved the idea of a cheap bargain.
One of the biggest ways in which the new industrialization impacted fashion was through advances in metalworking. One example of this is sprung steel, which was first invented in the 1760s. They discovered that increasing the amounts of carbon and silicon in steel when it was in its molten state would increase not only the strength but also the elasticity of the metal. And over the next 150 years, this would be put to various different uses, including fashionable ones. It was the discovery of sprung steel, or the invention of sprung steel, for example, that made the 1856 invention of the cage crinoline possible. The cage crinoline, of course, being a steel petticoat that supports the skirts lightly and easily. It was also the invention of sprung steel that made lightweight cage bustles and crinolets and sleeve supports possible. It also made corsetry a lot cheaper. While whalebone continued to be used in corsetry up until the 1920s, beginning in around the 1860s, the new sprung steel was beginning to be introduced as an alternative to whalebone. And that meant that corsets could be made much more cheaply, and the boning was a lot more durable. Another example of industrialism impacting fashion is the relatively small-seeming invention of the metal eyelet. For most of history, eyelets have been worked by hand and encased in thread, or sometimes they would have a carved bone eyelet. Those were expensive, though. But in the 1830s, the metal eyelet was invented. Now, it took about a decade for the metal eyelet to become ubiquitous in fashionable applications, but once it did, it was very clear that the metal eyelet was here to stay. While 18th century stays and 16th century bodies had been more aimed at smoothing out the silhouette and creating a strong foundation for the heavy skirts and garments that would go over top of it, the invention of the middle eyelet meant that Victorian corsets could be laced much more tightly than their ancestor garments. Now, while tight lacing was practiced in the 19th century, it was by no means common. However, even though most women did not tight lace their corsets, Victorian corsets do have much more of a shape that they impose upon the body than their ancestors had, and that was made possible by the invention of the metal eyelet. While it's true that pretty much all women in the 18th century did wear stays, most 18th century women likely only had one set of stays, and those stays would have had to last them for longer than a corset would have to last a Victorian lady. And because corsets could now be made much more cheaply and easily, the fashionable corset shape could change much more quickly than the fashionable shape for stays could change. Yet another element of industrialization that impacted fashion was the 1850 invention of the sewing machine. Although very elaborately crafted and cut and stitched garments had existed for centuries, they were, again, generally reserved for the super elites. Most people were wearing simple garments cut from simple shapes and sewn up with simple seams. The invention of the sewing machine changed that. Before the sewing machine, most people simply did not have time to fuss about with insertion lakes and tucks and gathers and frills and what have you. The sewing machine made the sewing process much faster, meaning that all of a sudden ordinary people could indulge in these fashionable frivolous elements. And that means that over the course of the 19th century, you see ordinary people's clothing becoming more and more ornate. Even their underwear is becoming ornate and decorated and pretty, even though nobody's ever going to see that. But they can do that now because they've got the sewing machine, which makes things go quickly. They've got machine-made lace. So it's cheap. Why not put it on your chemise? Similarly, advances in weaving technology meant that fabric became significantly less expensive over the course of the 19th century, so ordinary people could indulge in things like ruffles and overskirts and bustles and the like. They could use more fabric because they could afford more fabric because of the industrial processes. The new industrialization also did not only impact women's clothing. A great example of how it impacted men's clothing is the 1885 invention of the celluloid collar and cuffs. This invention meant that men no longer had to pay to have cloth collars laundered and starched. Instead, they could just have one set of celluloid collar and cuffs that could be rinsed clean under the tap every night and shaken dry, and then go on the next morning looking absolutely pristine. This meant that not only could more men partake in the fashion for stiff collars and cuffs, but also that collars and cuffs could become higher and stiffer than ever before. Now, I could go on ad nauseum about how industrialization impacted Victorian fashions, but I think you probably get the point. People had access to all of these new technologies, all of these things that they could never do before, and they kind of went crazy with them. And you can see this in all aspects of Victorian life, not just with clothing. For example, when they invented the telephone, they were so excited that they named a pea after it. This is a time in which people had the ability to do things that they could never do before, and not only that, but they had the ability to do them on a massive scale, a scale that would not have even been conceivable just a few decades prior. In a way, I think that the Victorian era is very, very similar to the Elizabethan age, the age of exploration. In the second half of the 16th century, Europeans were being exposed to all sorts of new and different things from all over the world, and again, as a result, they went a little bit crazy with them. For example, a lot of Elizabethan recipes call for combinations of foods and spices that sound maybe a little bit odd to us today, but they were discovering all of these new lands and things to which they'd never been exposed before, and they wanted to use them in every way they could, including by putting them on a plate. In 1577, the English clergyman William Harrison remarked on, quote, "How many strange herbs, plants, and annual fruits are daily brought unto us from the Indies, Americas, Taprobane, the Canary Islands, and all parts of the world." Taprobane is another word for Sri Lanka or Ceylon. This new wonder and excitement of discovery is very similar to the attitudes that we can see in the Victorian era surrounding the fruits and products of industrialization. Because it was so influenced and driven by industrial processes and industrial advancements, Victorian fashion actually feels significantly more modern to me than 21st century fashion does. Now, it's true that some cutting-edge technologies these days are influencing fashions, things like virtual reality and 3D printing, but these things are novelties. They're not mainstream, and they're not driving fashion. Similarly, synthetic fabrics are ubiquitous today. But again, I would make the argument that they are not driving fashions. Synthetic fabrics are trying to mimic the appearance of natural fibers. They aren't pushing the envelope in their own right, they're just aping something else. In the Victorian era, on the other hand, the industrial advancements were driving these changes in fashion directly. That is something that we did not see before the Victorian era, and it's something that I don't feel like we've seen since the Victorian era either. I'm going to close off this video with a comment left underneath the original version of this video by Chloe Westfall, Quirky Victorian. Quote, "I think so much of the Victorian mindset was about conquering nature and shaping the world to their liking. It was a very optimistic time, not unlike the 1950s and 60s, where the sky really seemed to be the limit for innovation, and then not even the sky. You can see that a little bit in the styles of those 2 decades, but nothing after the Victorian era comes close to how extreme they took it. And, as you said, what really set the Victorian era apart from what came before it was that these styles were actually accessible to all but the most destitute. No wonder the progress was so exciting. The average Victorian could really feel that he had a hand in it. I think that's why you see a blossoming in those decades of everything from exploration to social reform movements to science fiction and endless innovations. Everything could be changed and expanded and improved, and the middle class really felt like they had the power to share in that. So why not the human form? If not for the First World War, who knows how far into the 20th century this might have continued. So you're right in saying that Victorian styles were more modern in spirit than anything we have today or have had since."